The lock turned at precisely 2:47 in the morning on March 14, 1859, when Archbishop Michael Brennan's private secretary, Father Thomas Walsh, finally used the master key he'd carried for 12 years but never dared employ. What he found behind that carved mahogany door in the bishop's private quarters would shatter the moral authority of one of Charleston's most powerful religious institutions and expose a system of ecclesiastical complicity that reached from South Carolina to the Vatican itself. But before we continue with what Father Walsh discovered in that locked chamber, a discovery so devastating that 3 separate church investigations would be suppressed, and documentation would vanish from diocesan archives for over a century, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. Comment the word truth below if you believe these stories must never be forgotten. Tell me where you're watching from, because this is our history, our legacy, and our responsibility to remember. The algorithms try to bury these stories. Your engagement keeps them alive. Now let's go back to where this began, because the horror Father Walsh encountered that night had roots that stretched back 12 years to a transaction that should never have occurred, and a sin that would compound with every passing day. Charleston, South Carolina, 1847. The city's elite moved through a world of carefully maintained appearances where wealth, power, and piety formed an unholy trinity. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Charleston occupied a unique position in this slave society, publicly condemning the worst excesses of bondage while privately holding enslaved people as church property, their labor funding schools, hospitals, and the bishop's residence itself. Bishop Michael Brennan, appointed in 1845 at age 42, had built a reputation as a moderate voice, a man who spoke eloquently about Christian charity while never quite challenging the fundamental economics of human ownership. The bishop's household staff in 1847 consisted of 8 enslaved people, their names meticulously recorded in church ledgers under institutional assets, 2 cooks, 3 housekeepers, 2 groundskeepers, and 1 personal valet. The diocese paid their previous owners market rates, between $800 and $9,100 per person, documenting each transaction with the same precision used for purchasing communion wine and altar candles. These were not the enslaved people who would become the center of our story. Those 2 girls were acquired through different means, in a transaction that left no official record, no bill of sale, no ledger entry. They simply appeared in the bishop's private quarters in late November 1847, and for 12 years, almost no one knew they existed. Their names were Sarah and Rebecca. They were 9 years old. They were twins, and they had been born free. Their mother, Catherine Morrison, was a free woman of color who operated a small seamstress shop on Meeting Street, one of Charleston's few black business owners who'd managed to purchase her own freedom and establish a legitimate trade. Their father's identity was never publicly confirmed, but parish records and private correspondence suggest he was a white merchant of some prominence, prominent enough that his relationship with Catherine, while known in certain circles, was never openly acknowledged. The girls had inherited their mother's skill with needle and thread, their father's light complexion, and a legal status that should have protected them. Free papers, properly notarized and registered with the city, documenting their birth to a free mother and thus their own freedom under South Carolina law. Catherine Morrison died of yellow fever on November 3, 1847. She was 31 years old. The epidemic that swept Charleston that fall killed over 300 people, and in the chaos of mass burials and quarantine measures, 2 9-year-old girls with no immediate family became vulnerable in ways that free status alone could not prevent. Their mother's shop was liquidated to pay debts. Their father, if he was who correspondence suggests, made no claim. And into this vacuum stepped Bishop Michael Brennan, who attended Catherine Morrison's funeral, who spoke movingly about Christian charity and the church's duty to orphans, and who personally took custody of Sarah and Rebecca Morrison on November 18, 1847. The official story, the one recorded in the bishop's private journal and shared with his closest advisors, was one of benevolent rescue. The girls would be housed in the bishop's residence temporarily, would receive education and religious instruction, and would eventually be placed with a suitable Catholic family, or perhaps join a convent as lay sisters when they came of age. It was an act of mercy, the bishop explained, a Christian response to tragic circumstances. The diocese's attorney, James Rutledge, prepared guardianship papers. The bishop signed them. The girls moved into the episcopal residence at 114 Broad Street, and then they disappeared from all public record. No school enrollment, no church registry entry, no mention in diocesan reports or correspondence. For 12 years, Sarah and Rebecca Morrison existed in a space that official documentation refused to acknowledge. Not enslaved according to any legal instrument, not free according to any observable reality, but held in a condition that had no name, because naming it would require the church to confront what it had become complicit in creating. Father Thomas Walsh, appointed as the bishop's private secretary in 1848, first became aware of the girl's existence 3 months into his tenure. He'd been instructed that the bishop's private chambers, a suite of rooms on the residence's 3rd floor, were absolutely off limits. The bishop took his meals there most evenings. He worked there late into the night. He required absolute privacy, and Father Walsh's duties explicitly excluded any access to or inquiry about those spaces. But sounds travel through old buildings, and Father Walsh began to notice things. 2 sets of footsteps when there should have been one, whispered conversations in the early morning hours, food orders that seemed excessive for a single occupant, and twice, just twice in those first months, a glimpse of movement through a partially open door, a flash of dark hair and a young face before the door closed firmly. He said nothing. The culture of hierarchical obedience in the Catholic Church of that era did not permit junior clergy to question their superiors, especially not about matters the superior had clearly designated as private. Father Walsh focused on his duties, managing the bishop's correspondence, coordinating diocesan meetings, handling the endless administrative details of running a religious institution in a slave society. But the awareness sat in his mind like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. The bishop's household staff, the 8 enslaved people who maintained the residence, knew. Of course they knew. They saw the meals prepared in portions for 3. They laundered clothing sized for young girls. They heard the sounds from the 3rd floor, but they existed in a different kind of silence, one enforced not by religious obedience, but by the absolute power dynamics of enslavement, speaking about what they knew would accomplish nothing except to bring danger to themselves. So they maintained the bishop's secret as they maintained his household, because they had no choice, because survival meant understanding which truths could be spoken and which had to be carried in silence. What was happening in those 3rd floor chambers, the full truth would only emerge years later, through testimony given during church investigations, and through the journals Sarah Morrison herself would eventually write. But the essential facts are these. The bishop kept the twins in a suite of 3 rooms, a bedroom they shared, a small sitting room, and a workroom equipped with sewing equipment, fabric, and supplies. They were taught to read and write, but only enough to follow written instructions. They were given religious instruction, but in private, never attending public mass. They were fed adequately and clothed appropriately. They were not physically brutalized in the ways that characterized plantation slavery, but they were not free. They could not leave. They had no contact with the outside world. Their labor, and their labor was constant, belonged entirely to the bishop. They sewed vestments for the diocese. altar cloths for churches across South Carolina, fine linens that the bishop gifted to wealthy parishioners. Their skill, inherited from their mother and refined through years of forced practice, produced work of extraordinary quality. The bishop accepted commissions, charged premium prices, and kept every cent. The girls received nothing, no wages, no portion of the proceeds, no acknowledgement that their hands created the value he extracted. And there was another dimension to their captivity, one that the historical record approaches with careful language, but cannot fully obscure. The bishop was their guardian, their captor, their sole human contact beyond brief interactions with household staff. He controlled every aspect of their existence. He determined what they wore, what they ate, when they slept, what they learned, how they spent every hour of every day. This absolute power, exercised over 12 years on two girls who aged from 9 to 21 in his custody, created conditions where exploitation could take forms that went beyond labor extraction. The church investigations that would eventually occur used phrases like inappropriate intimacy and boundary violations. Sarah Morrison's later testimony was more direct. He owned us in every way a person can own another person. The system that enabled this horror was not unique to Bishop Brennan. Across the antebellum South, the Catholic Church participated in slavery while maintaining a careful rhetorical distance from its worst excesses. Dioceses owned enslaved people. Priests inherited enslaved people. Religious orders, including the Jesuits who operated Georgetown University, bought and sold enslaved people to fund their institutions. The Church's official position condemned slavery's abuses while accepting slavery's existence, creating a moral framework that allowed individual clergy to rationalize their participation in a fundamentally evil system. Bishop Brennan's particular innovation was to exploit the vulnerability of free black children in a society that offered them legal status but no practical protection. Sarah and Rebecca Morrison were not kidnapped in the conventional sense. They were not sold. They were rescued through mechanisms that appeared charitable, then held through a combination of physical isolation and psychological manipulation that made their free papers meaningless. The bishop never filed legal documents claiming ownership because he didn't need to. He simply kept them, and the systems of power that surrounded him, ecclesiastical, legal, social, never questioned his right to do so. Father Walsh's awareness of the situation evolved slowly over the years. By 1852, he knew the girls existed. By 1855, he understood they were being held against their will. By 1857, he had begun to grasp the full scope of the exploitation. But understanding and action are not the same thing, and Father Walsh faced a calculation that paralyzed him. If he reported what he knew, who would he report to? The bishop was the highest Catholic authority in South Carolina. The civil authorities in Charleston had no interest in challenging a powerful white religious leader over the status of two girls of color. The church hierarchy above the bishop, archbishops and cardinals in Baltimore and Rome, existed within the same system of complicity that enabled the bishop's actions in the first place. So Father Walsh did nothing. He maintained the bishop's schedule, managed his correspondence, and carried the knowledge of what was happening on the third floor, like a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. Later, during the investigations, he would describe this period as a kind of moral paralysis, a state where the gap between knowing something was wrong and possessing the power to stop it created a psychological prison of its own. He was not the villain of this story. That role belonged solely to Bishop Brennan, but he was complicit through inaction, and that complicity would haunt him for the rest of his life. The situation might have continued indefinitely. The bishop was only 54 in 1857, in good health, with every expectation of many more years in his position. Sarah and Rebecca were 21, their entire adolescence and young adulthood consumed by captivity, their mother's free papers locked in a drawer somewhere in the bishop's chambers, their legal status as free women rendered meaningless by the simple fact that no one with power cared to enforce it. They had no avenue for escape, no allies, no access to legal representation, no way to make their situation known to anyone who might intervene. But then the bishop made a mistake. In January 1859, he fell ill with pneumonia. For 3 weeks he was confined to his bed, too sick to maintain his usual absolute control over his private chambers. The household staff, necessarily, had greater access to the 3rd floor. Father Walsh, managing diocesan business in the bishop's absence, had legitimate reasons to enter areas previously forbidden, and the girls themselves, for the first time in 12 years, had moments of reduced surveillance, brief windows when the bishop's illness created gaps in the total control he'd maintained over their existence. Sarah Morrison, the more outgoing of the twins, seized one of those moments. On February 3, 1859, while the bishop slept and Father Walsh worked in the study below, she slipped a note under the door of the housekeeper's room. The housekeeper, an enslaved woman named Martha, found it that evening. The note was brief, written in the careful script Sarah had been taught. "We are free. We are held here against our will. We have papers. Please help us." Martha faced her own impossible calculation. She was enslaved. She had no legal standing to challenge the bishop, but she had watched these girls grow up in captivity, had seen their situation, had carried the knowledge of it for years. She made a choice that was both courageous and pragmatic. She gave the note to Father Walsh. Father Walsh read it on February 4, 1859. He sat with it for 3 days, wrestling with 12 years of complicity and the question of what action he could possibly take that wouldn't simply make things worse. The bishop was recovering. Soon he would resume full control. The window for intervention was closing. On February 7th, Father Walsh made his decision. He would not go to civil authorities. They would be useless. He would not go to church authorities above the bishop. They would suppress any investigation. Instead, he would document everything, gather evidence, and wait for the right moment to force the issue into the open in a way that couldn't be ignored or buried. He began by searching the bishop's study when the bishop was asleep. He found correspondence about the girls' sewing commissions, financial records showing income from their work, and, crucially, Catherine Morrison's original free papers for Sarah and Rebecca, locked in a drawer with the bishop's personal documents. He made copies of everything. He interviewed Martha and 2 other household staff members, taking careful notes of their testimony about what they'd witnessed over the years. He compiled a dossier that documented not just the girls' captivity, but the systematic exploitation and the bishop's deliberate concealment of their free status. And then he waited. The bishop recovered from his pneumonia in late February. He resumed his normal routine. He noticed nothing amiss. Father Walsh maintained his usual duties, carrying his dossier of evidence and watching for an opportunity. That opportunity came on March 13, 1859, when the bishop left Charleston for a 3-day trip to Columbia to meet with state legislators about a proposed Catholic school funding bill. For the first time in 12 years, the bishop would be away from the residence overnight. For the first time in 12 years, Father Walsh would have unsupervised access to the 3rd floor. For the first time in 12 years, Sarah and Rebecca would spend a night without their captor in the building. Father Walsh made his plan. He would wait until the household was asleep. He would use the master key he'd carried for years but never employed. He would enter the bishop's private chambers. He would speak directly to Sarah and Rebecca. He would offer them a choice. They could leave immediately, that very night, with his help and with their mother's free papers as proof of their status. Or they could wait for him to pursue official channels, knowing that official channels might take months or years and might ultimately fail. But the choice would be theirs, because whatever else happened, he would not allow them to remain in captivity without at least offering them the chance to escape. At 2:47 a.m. on March 14, 1859, Father Thomas Walsh turned the master key in the lock of the bishop's private chambers and opened the door to a suite of rooms he'd never entered in 12 years of service. What he found confirmed everything he'd documented and suspected. A bedroom with 2 narrow beds, a sitting room with a small library of religious texts, and a workroom filled with sewing equipment, bolts of fabric, and partially completed vestments of extraordinary quality. And sitting in that workroom, awake despite the hour because they'd heard the lock turn and didn't know whether to hope or fear, were Sarah and Rebecca Morrison, 21 years old, free by law and enslaved by power, waiting to learn whether this night would bring liberation or simply a new form of captivity. Father Walsh told them everything. He showed them the copies he'd made of their mother's free papers. He explained what he'd documented and what he planned to do, and then he offered them the choice: leave now or wait for official intervention that might never come. Sarah Morrison would later write about this moment in her journal. For 12 years, no one had asked us what we wanted. No one had offered us a choice. The bishop decided everything, and now this priest, this man who'd known about us for years and done nothing, was asking us to decide our own fate. I was angry at him for waiting so long. I was grateful that he'd finally acted. I was terrified of what would happen if we left. I was more terrified of what would happen if we stayed. Rebecca and I looked at each other and we knew. We'd survive 12 years by staying together. We'd survive whatever came next the same way. They chose to leave. That night, immediately, Father Walsh had prepared for this possibility. He had money, not much, but enough for train tickets. He had contacts, a Catholic family in Philadelphia who opposed slavery and who he trusted to provide temporary shelter. He had a plan: get the girls out of Charleston before the bishop returned, get them to Philadelphia, and then use his documentation to force a church investigation that couldn't be suppressed because the victims would be beyond the bishop's reach and able to testify publicly. At 3:15 a.m., Sarah and Rebecca Morrison walked out of 113 Broad Street for the first time in 12 years. They carried nothing but the clothes they wore and their mother's free papers, now returned to them. Father Walsh accompanied them to the train station, purchased tickets for the 6 a.m. northbound train, and waited with them in the colored waiting room until departure. At 6 a.m. on March 14, 1859, they boarded the train. At 6:17 a.m., as the train pulled out of Charleston, Sarah Morrison looked back at the city where she'd been born free, where her mother had died, where she'd spent 12 years in captivity, and she wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming, terrifying, exhilarating reality of freedom reclaimed. The bishop returned to Charleston on March 16th. He discovered the girls' absence within an hour of arriving home. His response revealed the calculation that had enabled their captivity. He did nothing publicly. He filed no missing persons report. He made no public inquiry. To do so would have required acknowledging the girls' existence, explaining their presence in his private chambers, and exposing himself to questions he couldn't answer without revealing his crimes. So he said nothing, and he waited, and he hoped that silence and power would protect him, as they had for 12 years. But Father Walsh had already acted. On March 15th, the day after the girls' escape, he sent his complete dossier, documentation of the captivity, copies of the free papers, testimony from household staff, financial records of the bishop's exploitation of the girls' labor, to 3 destinations simultaneously: the Archbishop of Baltimore, who had ecclesiastical authority over the Charleston diocese, the Apostolic Nuncio in Washington, the Pope's diplomatic representative in the United States, and the editor of The Liberator, the abolitionist newspaper published in Boston by William Lloyd Garrison. The church authorities received their copies and immediately began the process of suppression and damage control that Father Walsh had anticipated. But The Liberator received its copy and published the story on March 25, 1859, under the headline, "Catholic Bishop Held Free Negro Children in Captivity for 12 Years. Church Documents Reveal Systematic Exploitation and Abuse." The scandal was immediate and devastating. Northern newspapers picked up the story. Abolitionist groups demanded investigation. Catholic reformers within the church, already critical of the hierarchy's complicity with slavery, seized on the case as evidence of institutional moral corruption. The church could no longer suppress the investigation because the victims were safe in Philadelphia. The evidence was public, and the story had become a national cause. The formal church investigation began in April 1859. Bishop Michael Brennan was suspended from his duties pending the inquiry. Sarah and Rebecca Morrison testified in person and in writing, providing detailed accounts of their 12 years of captivity. Father Walsh testified, presenting his documentation and accepting responsibility for his years of inaction. Household staff testified, describing what they'd witnessed. The investigation lasted 4 months. The findings, issued in August 1859, were damning. Bishop Brennan had unlawfully detained 2 free children, exploited their labor for personal profit, concealed their existence from church and civil authorities, and engaged in conduct unbecoming a priest and bishop that the investigation declined to specify in detail, but that Sarah Morrison's testimony made clear. The church defrocked him, the harshest penalty available under canon law. He was stripped of all ecclesiastical authority and expelled from the priesthood. The civil authorities in Charleston, under pressure from northern states and facing national scrutiny, brought charges of unlawful detention and fraud. Brennan was convicted in December 1859 and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He served 4 years before dying of a stroke in 1863 at age 60. He never publicly acknowledged wrongdoing. He never apologized to Sarah and Rebecca Morrison. In his final statement before sentencing, he maintained that he had acted charitably, that he had provided the girls with shelter and education, that he had done nothing wrong. The court and the church disagreed, but Brennan himself went to his grave believing, or claiming to believe, that he had been a benefactor unjustly persecuted. Sarah and Rebecca Morrison remained in Philadelphia. The Catholic family that had sheltered them helped them establish a dressmaking business, building on the skills their mother had taught them and that 12 years of forced labor had refined. Their work was extraordinary. The same quality that had once enriched their captor now supported their independence. They never married. They lived together for the rest of their lives, 2 women bound by shared trauma and shared survival, building a life defined by freedom and self-determination. Sarah Morrison became an activist in the abolitionist movement, speaking publicly about her experience and advocating for the protection of free Black children in slave states. She testified before legislative committees. She wrote articles for abolitionist newspapers. She used her story as evidence of how slavery corrupted not just individual slaveholders, but entire institutions, including religious institutions that claimed moral authority while participating in systems of exploitation. In 1872, 13 years after her escape, Sarah Morrison published a memoir, 12 Years in the Bishop's Chamber, a testimony of captivity and freedom. The book provided the most detailed account of her and Rebecca's experience, including aspects of their captivity that the church investigation had declined to address publicly. It became a significant document in the literature of slavery and resistance, a first-hand account of how enslavement could take forms that legal definitions didn't capture, how free papers could be meaningless without power to enforce them, how captivity could exist in the heart of a city, how exploitation could hide behind the language of charity and Christian duty. Rebecca Morrison never spoke publicly about their experience. She supported Sarah's activism, but chose her own form of resistance, building a life of quiet dignity, creating beauty through her work, and refusing to let their captors' actions define the totality of her existence. She died in 1891 at age 53. Sarah died in 1903 at age 65. They were buried together in Philadelphia, their shared headstone bearing the inscription Sarah had chosen: born free, held captive, died free. Remember, the Catholic Church's response to the scandal evolved over time. Initially, church authorities treated the case as an aberration, the actions of one corrupt individual, rather than evidence of systemic problems. But the case contributed to growing pressure within the church to address its relationship with slavery. In 1866, the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore issued new guidelines prohibiting clergy from holding enslaved people and requiring dioceses to divest themselves of enslaved property. The guidelines were imperfect and inconsistently enforced, but they represented a shift driven in part by the scandal of Bishop Brennan's crimes. The documentation Father Walsh compiled, the evidence that made the investigation possible, was preserved in diocesan archives but largely inaccessible to researchers for over a century. In the 1980s, historians studying the Catholic Church's relationship with slavery discovered the files and began the process of bringing this story back into public consciousness. Sarah Morrison's memoir, out of print for decades, was republished in 1995 with scholarly annotations. The case became a focal point for understanding how slavery and exploitation could exist in forms that challenged simple legal categories, how institutions could be complicit through inaction as much as through direct participation, and how individual courage, whether Sarah Morrison's decision to slip that note under a door or Father Walsh's decision to finally act on what he'd known for years, could disrupt systems of power that seemed unbreakable. The house at 114 Broad Street still stands in Charleston. It's been converted to offices. There's no historical marker indicating what happened there. The third-floor rooms where Sarah and Rebecca Morrison spent 12 years of their lives are now used for storage. The Catholic Diocese of Charleston has never formally apologized for Bishop Brennan's actions or for the institutional failures that enabled them. The Church's official history of the diocese mentions the scandal briefly in passive language that obscures agency. An unfortunate incident occurred in 1859 involving the improper detention of 2 young women, leading to the removal of Bishop Brennan. But the story persists because Sarah Morrison ensured it would. Her memoir, her testimony, her activism, all were acts of resistance against the erasure that institutions prefer when confronted with their own complicity in evil. She refused to let the Church's comfortable narrative stand. She refused to let her and Rebecca's suffering be minimized or forgotten. She insisted that the world remember not just that they had been held captive, but that they had been born free, that their captivity was a violation of law and morality, and that the systems that enabled it, legal, religious, social, bore responsibility for every day of those 12 years. Father Thomas Walsh remained in the priesthood, though he was transferred to a small parish in rural Maryland, effectively exiled from positions of influence. He spent the rest of his career working with that community, never seeking advancement, carrying the weight of his 12 years of inaction. He corresponded with Sarah Morrison until his death in 1887. In those letters, preserved in her papers, he repeatedly expressed remorse for not acting sooner. Sarah's responses were complex. She acknowledged his final courage while never absolving him of his earlier complicity. In her last letter to him, written in 1886, she wrote, "You gave us the key to our freedom, and for that I am grateful. But you held that key for 12 years while we remained in captivity, and for that I cannot offer forgiveness, only understanding that moral courage is difficult, and that you found yours too late to spare us years of suffering, but soon enough to save us from a lifetime of it." The case raises questions that extend far beyond the specific facts of Sarah and Rebecca Morrison's captivity. How many other free black children in the antebellum South were held in similar conditions, their legal status rendered meaningless by power imbalances and institutional indifference? How many people in positions of authority, like Father Walsh, knew about exploitation and abuse, but remained silent because the systems around them offered no clear path for intervention? How do institutions, churches, governments, social structures maintain complicity with evil while claiming moral authority? And how do we today ensure that we're not replicating those same patterns of institutional complicity and individual paralysis in the face of injustice? The historical record can't answer how many other children suffered similar fates. The nature of such captivity, hidden, undocumented, enabled by the victim's vulnerability and the perpetrator's power, means that many cases left no trace. Sarah Morrison's story is known because Father Walsh finally acted, because she survived to testify, because she had the courage and resources to make her story public. How many others never had that chance? How many died in captivity, their free papers locked away, their existence erased from official records, their suffering known only to themselves and to perpetrators who had every incentive to maintain silence? These questions should haunt us. They should make us examine our own institutions, our own systems of power, our own capacity for complicity. The Catholic Church in 1847 was a respected institution that claimed moral authority while participating in and enabling slavery. What institutions today claim moral authority while participating in or enabling exploitation? What injustices are happening in spaces we can't see, to people whose vulnerability makes them invisible to systems of accountability? What do we know but choose not to act on because action seems too difficult, too risky, too likely to fail? Sarah Morrison's story is not just historical. It's a challenge to every generation to examine how power operates, how exploitation hides, and how institutions protect themselves rather than the vulnerable people they claim to serve. It's a reminder that legal status, free papers, citizenship, constitutional rights means nothing without the power to enforce it and the will of others to respect it. It's a testament to the courage required to resist when resistance seems impossible, and to the importance of documenting and remembering when powerful forces prefer erasure and silence. Now I need you to engage with this story in a way that honors Sarah and Rebecca Morrison's legacy. Comment below, what institutions today do you think need to be held accountable for hidden exploitation? Where do you see parallels between the systems that enabled the bishop's crimes and systems operating now? Share this video with someone who needs to understand how institutional complicity works. Subscribe to this channel because these stories, the ones that institutions tried to bury, the ones that challenge comfortable narratives, the ones that demand we examine our own complicity, are the stories that matter most. And ask yourself, if you were Father Walsh, carrying knowledge of injustice for 12 years, what would it take for you to finally act? If you were Sarah Morrison, held in captivity with only your sister for support, what would give you the courage to slip that note under the door? If you were part of the church hierarchy receiving Father Walsh's documentation, Would you have the integrity to pursue truth even when it damaged your institution's reputation? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions about who we are, what we're willing to tolerate, and whether we have the courage to act when action is difficult and costly. Sarah Morrison spent the rest of her life after her escape trying to ensure that her story would force people to confront these questions. The least we can do is honor that effort by actually confronting them, by letting her experience challenge our assumptions, and by committing ourselves to the kind of vigilance and courage that prevents such exploitation from happening again. Remember Sarah and Rebecca Morrison. Remember that they were born free. Remember that their captivity was enabled by systems that claimed righteousness while practicing evil. Remember that their liberation required individual courage from multiple people: Sarah herself, Father Walsh, Martha the housekeeper, the Philadelphia family that sheltered them. Remember that institutions will always prefer silence and suppression over accountability. And remember that the only counter to institutional power is individual and collective courage. The courage to speak truth, to document injustice, to act even when action seems futile, and to refuse to let the powerful erase the stories of those they've harmed. This is our history. This is our legacy. This is our responsibility to remember and to learn from. Don't let the algorithm bury it. Don't let institutional narratives sanitize it. Don't let the passage of time make it seem irrelevant. Sarah Morrison's story is as urgent today as it was in 1859 because the dynamics of power, exploitation, and complicity that enabled her captivity are still operating in different forms, and our obligation is to recognize them, resist them, and ensure that we're not the ones who, like Father Walsh, carry knowledge of injustice for years without acting. Comment truth if you're committed to that obligation. Tell me where you're watching from. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel and carry Sarah and Rebecca Morrison's legacy forward by refusing to be complicit in the injustices of our own time.